Welcome, welcome all. As I said, it's good to see you all. Hope you're being safe and making it through this pandemic as populations start to get vaccinated. And above all, keeping hope as you work in your communities to make the world a little bit better wherever you are. So today we have a great setup of introducing some case material on scale squared. And before that, Daniel will continue our lesson on using statistics in order to measure the scaling up process. Before we get into all that, I just want to take a quick moment to talk about your lab number 2, strategy for growth. About half of you have gotten those in so far, and everyone who had submitted before 8 o'clock this morning now will have your grade up in Moodle. What I've seen was really, really fantastic work, folks. I know this was a complex assignment. There were a lot of different pieces. You all did a valiant effort of the scenario planning process, which I know we had a lot of questions about. And for those of you who have not yet turned in your assignment, I encourage you to do so. Please reach out to me if you're having doubts. And the optimal thing to do would be to submit your assignment by or before Sunday of this week. That way you're ready to go next week when we introduce lab number 3. So really great work. If you have any questions about your assignment, reach out to me, because from here, you'll be getting into the really exciting phase of now building out a action plan for scaling up. So now that you have the strategy that seems to be the strongest for growing your seed, how precisely will you do that? Balancing the different partner roles, working with the situation at the current timing, and looking at the resources that you'll need. So
Rosie, just to build on that, I really want to double down on what Rosie said of, if you've not submitted something, please do by this weekend. And beyond just what it may mean for your actual grade is Rosie's point that from here, you're going to move into creating an action plan. And anybody who's ever been part of a planning process knows that it's very easy to want to spend a lot of time on your strategy. You've had time to spend on your strategy, but at this point, at some point when you're working on a strategy, you need to just get it done so you can move on to the planning process. Because the whole reason to have a strategy is we know it's an outline of your plan. It's the general terms. You will get the opportunity in your next assignment to keep cooking and evolving these ideas. But it's really important to move from the strategy side of this to starting to really hammer it out and put it into a clear and detailed plan. And if you think you want more time for your strategy right now, I can promise you in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, you're really going to want that extra week on your plan. So please get them in so that we can get, because everything, the first 2 assignments are just helping you do the background for this next assignment. This is where it all comes together. And so you want to have as much time on that as possible. Sorry, Rosie, I just wanted to reiterate that because, as you know, everybody always wants more time on the plan.
Absolutely, yeah. So as I mentioned, we'll be formally introducing that assignment next week. So stick out for that, and we'll have about a month to work on that. It'll be due at the end of May. Okay, any other questions I see I've been getting some conversations in the chat as well. All right. Then without further ado, Daniel, why don't you start us off with your presentation?
Great. Okay, folks, this is fun. So let me share screens. Can somebody give me a hand signal? Can you see the screen? Okay. Let me get the slideshow started then. Okay, what I want to show you about is the idea of positive deviance.
Are you using two monitors?
Yeah.
Can you swap which one you're sharing? We're seeing the presenter mode, not the presentation mode. So it's fine, but we also see all the slides and the next slide. And so.
Yeah, okay, understand. Let me,
Yeah, maybe just that. There you go.
Yeah.
okay. Positive deviance, folks. There's a secret. There's a lovely secret in the normal curve. Remember 3 lessons ago, we talked about the normal curve. This is your community, okay? Well, in your community, there's a lot of similarity. People are different. And the question is now how you're going to be advancing and having that community, which is your normal curve. And we normally think of that community by geography. But with scale squared, and with the example of Curitiba, what we're asking you to think of is other communities you're part of. Okay? In seed scale, the idea of community is a group of people that share something in common. So Curitiba would not probably, if you were an urban planner, been a community in India or Afghanistan that you would have thought of as a community that's relevant to you because it's in southern Brazil. Now, Herman in Bolivia may have said, oh, it's just nearby me. But the important point that I'm trying to make here is that there are other communities that you can learn from. Here we have your whole community as the normal curve. But what scale squared does is it finds the outlier communities. So let me move over to here. This is our world community. Okay? We're suddenly thinking of ourselves as part of the world and finding communities that are similar to us. So you might be looking for other green communities, or you might be looking for other red communities or other blue communities. You're trying to find similarities in the other communities around the world. So what this means is that when you find this larger community of the whole world, now with the idea of positive deviance, you're way out here at the end of the curve looking for the high performers. Okay, you're looking for those who are similar to you, with whom you share something in common and are performing very well. So go back a couple of slides. This is your regular geographical community in Afghanistan, in India, in the United States, but somewhere in the world, there is a community very similar to you that is a high performer. And you can learn from these high-performing communities. What you're trying to find is some aspect of those communities that is a positive deviant, that has differed from the normal. You're not trying to be here in the middle. That's where you are. You're trying to find out here at the edge of the normal curve, somebody who has learned something that you can use. Now, in the case of Curitiba, what we saw here, let me go to this next, pardon me, this slide here, pushing the wrong direction. This one was that poor performing communities over here on the left of the curve, places like Moscow, places like New York City that were having communication, transportation problems, they came to Curitiba. They moved from over here. They were poor performers in travel and transportation. And they came and they learned from Curitiba. They moved my screen is jumping around on me, pardon me. They moved from one side, the poor performers, to the other side. And what they did here was they were going to adopt ideas from Curitiba down here. It's the idea of scale squared. They were going to adopt ideas, but they weren't going to just copy the ideas. They were going to adapt them. They were going to improve the idea. And they were going to, I'm moving my screen on. They were going to improve the idea by adapting it and doing so adeptly, okay? So we're playing a word game here with adopt and adapt and adept. But the point is that you're somebody here in the middle of the normal curve, that is you in your community, is learning from another community way on the other side of the world. So you're over here as this blue, you're finding that there's somebody else who's also blue, but a bit different type of blue from you. You have noticed that this blue here is similar to your blue in some ways. You have not taken the greens or the oranges. You found a blue that you can learn from. In the global normal curve. And so then, pardon me, folks. So you are finding that person here, or finding that community here, and you're going to bring it in. And the process that you do in this thing is called experimentation. The way that you adapt is by experimenting. You will have found the idea. Your blue here will have found this blue here that's similar. So you're starting to adopt. But then you have to experiment to adapt it. And the more effectively you experiment, it becomes adept. And then as it becomes adept, as it really fits your community, action learning happens. And your whole community starts to use the new ideas. So what we're going to do now through the rest of this class is to focus on how the example of Curitiba is a relevant example for you. Most of you are not planning cities, okay? But what you have seen in the Curitiba case is how people from all over the world found in the example of one city in Brazil ideas that they could adopt, but they had to change them. They had to adapt them so that they fit their local situation. Scale squared, as Luke will say right after I stop talking, when you can get it to work, is almost magical. Okay? But it is very difficult. What you find is that you're unleashing the power of your community to improve something that already exists by adopting it and adapting it through experimentation, where your whole community is learning, is engaged in this action learning process. And in this modern world that we have of the internet, we have the ability to find these examples, to find these positive deviants that are way out on the end of the bell curve, and to use them as case studies for us to learn from. So Luke, it's over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. So as Daniel mentioned, we will be talking a bit about Curitiba, which is one of my favorite cases to at least to teach or to talk about. And I was thinking about that last night and rereading this case for I don't know how many, at least 100 times. Why is it? Well, one thing about it is really short. And so I think it's easy to just wow, something really impressive happened, and that was easy. It was tight. It was concise. But I think more importantly, it goes back to some of this question of what Daniel's asking about. Why are we trying to find these scale squared examples? And there are two really important questions when you think about scale squared. There is the very hard part of it, what Daniel was mentioning, something that is what Daniel and I have struggled with most of our careers, which is how to create scale squared centers intentionally that other people can learn from. That is a very hard thing to do. It's very complex. But luckily, I doubt many of you are actually going to be in that situation anytime soon. Much more importantly is you will be working at, say, a scale 1 level where you're mobilizing energy. And it goes back to this point about what Daniel was saying of how can you learn from the experiences of others? Because that is the function. If you look at scale squared in Seed Scale, we call it self-help centers. So the emphasis tends to be on where it's happening or the place. But the important thing here for all of you is to understand how important it is to learn from the experiences of others, to find those positive deviants. And they can sometimes, as Rosie knows and Daniel know, there's a whole approach to identifying successes locally called positive deviance that comes out of nutrition. It's a really fun research method if anybody's looking for a really good research method that synergizes with Seed Scale. But at a more meta level, we are trying to find these positive deviants. But there's a problem. Working with these scale squared examples, these positive deviants can be problematic. Because as Daniel correctly said, they are outliers. Something unique, normally in most cases, when you find a scale squared center, you say, well, a unique set of circumstances led to the creation of this. And that goes back to the importance of what Daniel was saying of adapting what you learn, because often you can't just adopt it immediately. Your situation will be a little different. And so this brings us back to the question of there's a lot of great work out there and there's a lot of positive deviance out there. But for years, I've been fascinated with this question of what makes a good case. How do you, because this is where it comes for us to think about how to use scale squared centers for ourselves. How do you go about identifying a good case example that you can learn from? Because you can go and learn from many different communities and see them. But then you say, well, we couldn't really do it like that in my community because of the following reasons. And so it's always important to learn and read about these examples, whether they're historical health projects in India, as we've done in previous weeks, or they're a giant urban planning project in southern Brazil. These are important. But what's really important for you to understand coming away from this is how critical it is and will be for you to be successful in this line of work, to be able to effectively identify communities that are similar to your own that you can learn from. Your community needs a mentor. It needs another community that it can learn from, that it can mentor under. And that's the more important reason to learn about scale squared. Is not necessarily to create your own scale squared center, but is to understand how to go about identifying them and learning from them. And I think that's why Curitiba is such a fun case to teach, because as very few of us will get to be in an urban planning context such as this. Very few of us will get to ever design a highway system. I know I won't. That's just not something I will ever do. But the process, because it's a scale squared case example in urban planning, it seems very accessible to all of us because we're planners, right? We're trying to, your next assignment in this class is to come up with a plan. And most development practitioners like to plan. Daniel has a doctoral degree in planning. So that's what we do in seed scale. Blueprint approach. If that doesn't talk about planning, I don't know what does. And Daniel can tell you that urban planners have tried to use Curitiba as a blueprint historically, and it hasn't worked. Okay, but this is why it's a big, complex case that seems very accessible to us. Because it starts with the common approach to development, which is planning. But they do it a little differently. So let's talk about Curitiba, because it's a great place. And I've got to say, I really enjoyed reading this case last night because I started to think, I wonder what Curitiba's like now in COVID. Are all these stats the same? And so I've given myself a homework assignment, which is I'm going to go do some research on what happened in Curitiba during COVID. So if I find out anything interesting, we'll report on that. Daniel, do you want to?
Yeah, I want to let you know that in Curitiba, COVID went through the roof. There are just thousands of cases of Curitiba because everybody was coming together and talking. All the connections that we're making on the buses and those tubes and whatnot encourage Curitiba, encourage connection. But
Sure.
then I read in the newspapers that people were starting to use the parks and the open air spaces. And so there was a subgroup in Curitiba that was social distancing. So Luke's question is totally relevant, but the people were learning to adapt.
Well, without going into where Curitiba is now, I think historically, who wants to take a crack at saying what what happened in Curitiba? What was the catalyst? There are several key things, but as we said, this is a case about urban planning. And so there are two mayors that we hear about in the case, but the first mayor did something very interesting. What did he do? Melchiade? You're muted, Melchiade.
The first mayor created a leadership team for planning.
He did. Well, specifically within that leadership team, he hosted a competition for urban designs, for urban plans. People could submit them, right? So instead of saying, so that in itself shows some creativity. Let me hear your ideas more than a specific problem. And specifically, he wanted, what the case doesn't do a good enough job of explaining is, this all began in the 1950s as the leaders of Curitiba realized that over the coming decades, they were going to see a massive influx of people moving from rural areas to urban areas. And this is one reason this case is so fascinating is, 4/5 of the world people live in cities now. And that's an impressive number. So in preparation for this, they had a competition. And the winner of that competition went on to be the next mayor. So this shows you that, as you say, that leadership team really had some very dynamic individuals on it. But what was the first major thing that came forward in that first plan that Jaime Lerner put forward? He put it forward and he won the competition with it. And what was really unique or interesting about that plan? Yep, Melchiade?
He make a competition about transportation.
Yeah.
About,
And what was interesting, what was different about Jaime's approach to transportation? He did something very interesting that the case describes.
The plan was about subways system, but subways were expensive. They decided to adopt ways beyond the ground. 5 arteries.
Exactly. They adopted to what Daniel was saying about the effective use of seed scale or scale squared centers. They adopted the idea and the efficiencies. They said the idea of a subway system has some inherent efficiencies. So we're going to adopt that idea. But they didn't have enough money. Now, most city planners at this point would stop. But instead, in this case, Curitiba, once again, they learned from other communities, other cities, and they said subways work. They're an effective means of mass transportation, but they're expensive. So they adapted the idea of the subway and into a bus system. It's a rather brilliant idea. Let's design our bus system around the principles of a subway system. There's nothing, I mean, when you hear it like that, it says, well, that's rather revolutionary. But there's nothing complicated necessarily about that. They adopted a really good idea and they made it affordable. Well, I know people who do that all the time. So, and specifically, it led them to a design that was able to very effectively move people from the outside, from the outskirts of the city into the middle without slowing down traffic. And it talks about the 3-lane artery systems and the areas that cross. They also did something else very interesting, which is the platforms to get on and off the buses and the ticketing system. So they replicated subway systems there. They said one reason subways work is it doesn't take people long to get on or off this bus system. And so they were able to make that more efficient, right? Now we're hearing the adeptly, right? So they adopted the good idea of subways, they adapted it into a bus system, and then they figured out how to make it as accessible and cheap as possible. And it's very impressive to hear that, 80% of the city uses that transportation system, regardless or not of whether they're rich or they're poor. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, that's the key piece there. So then what happened? Was everything fixed in Curitiba at that point? Irfani, did you want to say something?
Yeah, another point that was important for me in Curitiba, the official tried to give the people the hope of quality of life by making parkland and reducing pollution and also controlling the danger from flooding. After that, people feel they can have better life and they can improve the quality of life.
Exactly. So let's unpack that a bit, because several things are very, very interesting, as you correctly said. One very unique thing that we see going on in the Curitiba example is a lot of inclusivity. They are constantly, and that Daniel may know a bit more about it. It is one reason, the key reason that this case is so successful. But as to why that leadership team decided to be that inclusive and visionary is why this is a positive deviant. Is you could have done many of these same actions. And when we look at why Curitiba was not successful in a blueprint model, when they tried to, Jaime Lerner went on and became a national minister after being mayor of Curitiba and tried to replicate the Curitiba experience or design across Brazil, and it didn't work. Well, the issue, Daniel, and I'll let you jump in, but the problem there, I imagine, I wasn't there, was that, Jaime was a designer. He was an architect. He was a planner. And so what he tried to replicate was the design and not the experience. And what we see going on in Curitiba is something more than a design. It's an experience that says, for this community to advance, everyone must be included. Everyone must advance. That make it very unique. And we'll get into the exact examples of how that value system led to a rather extraordinary and visionary solution to a problem that also created these positive benefits. But Daniel, do you want to speak a bit about that?
Folks, we're on to a very important topic. It's the difference between design and process. Okay, slow down and think about this. Because Jaime Lerner was very successful as a mayor. He was not successful as a minister when he became a minister for all of Brazil, because he thought he could take his design, as Luke said, the blueprint, and have other cities around Brazil copy it. Well, people won't copy when somebody tells you to do something unless you're very powerful or you put the incentive of money. But in the beginning, he was inclusive by having that competition. Oh, Herman has put in a good example of this in his situation with La Paz. The point is that Jaime in the beginning had to be inclusive. He was insecure. He didn't have much power. He just had come in as mayor.
Well, in fact, he originally got involved by winning the competition as a
Right,
different sponsor.
right.
Yeah.
So he became inclusive. And the interesting idea about transportation that works is the transportation system is being inclusive. And in seed scale, you know, one of the 5 criteria is inclusiveness. The more inclusive you are, then your community is growing. It's the potential for acting together is increasing the more inclusive you are. It's a direct connection. And a bus system is a great way of making people inclusive. It puts the rich and the poor together. It puts the people outside the city and the people inside the city together. It's naturally building inclusiveness. Please, folks, take from this case study the very important thing of inclusiveness. Luke, back to you.
Great. So let's look at those examples, because as we said, the transportation was designed to be inclusive, but there could be some other reasons for that, right? Like it's just more effective, and that, you know, because you want everybody to have access to it because you're trying to cut down on congestion. But as Irfani correctly pointed out, they took it a step further. So let's hear from somebody who hasn't spoken up yet. What did they do? What was the problem? They had a problem with flooding in Curitiba. So how did they respond to that problem and create multiple solutions with their response?
Can I audible?
Hari, great, good to hear you.
Yeah. So in the flooded area, so they have the policy like no one can prepare the houses or residential area. They make a free from houses on that streamline near the river system. Also, they prepare some of the areas where the water can be stored during the flooding time.
Exactly. So if everybody caught what Hari was saying, they specifically started to identify the flood zone areas. So let's talk a little bit about a common problem in urban planning. In most cities, when poor people move in, they're poor normally because they don't have things, but when people move from the rural into an urban setting, they need a place to live. And very quickly, anybody who's spent time in an urban area knows about the way that migrant communities can set up, and they often set up in areas that are outside of the building code. And so this often means that the people's poorest communities, the poorest people in a city, live in some of the worst parts of the city, whether it's that they're exposed to chemicals, whether it's that they are exposed to bad soil, or in this case, people living in flood zones, areas that the city planners know have a tendency to flood. Poor people don't know that. They come and they see open land. They see water that's right there by the stream. And so what in the case of Curitiba they did is they took all the areas that they knew would be flood zones and they turned them into parks. Okay, so if you just leave a flood zone and say nobody go there, people will go there because they need a place to live and growth is happening. But by intentionally using these flood zones and turning them into parks and public spaces and greenways, they did several things. One, they started to improve the ecological restoration of the stream banks. And we know this whole concept of riparian areas, trees and healthy areas help prevent flooding. The roots of the trees will keep the stream banks in place. And so by intentionally doing urban planning and landscape architecture, they were able to build these green areas that were very functional. They're there for flood control. But they insisted, the city said they got a lot of pressure. The case is they got a lot of pressure to turn these spaces into housing and continue to get pressure. But instead they said, no, we're going to plant trees and then we're going to let the trees grow. Okay, keep in mind, creating green space does not happen overnight. You can build an apartment in a month. But to grow a nice green area with nice trees that people want to go and spend time, that takes years and years. And so in order to keep people from moving into these green areas, they also created a housing program. I think, and this to my mind, I had to reread that section several times last night and in my notes, I said, the planners at Curitiba realize that poor people are going to happen, that they're always going to have poor people in their community. Okay, and what a thing, because most urban planners try to hide their poor people. But Curitiba accepted. It's like when the medical community says we can make most people be healthy most of the time, but even best case scenario, 10% of our people are going to be sick. And we need to be prepared to take care of them. Well, that was the same planning mindset that they came up with. If we don't want people to move into flood zones, we need to provide them with good housing. And because we also have good transportation, some of the housing can be in downtown, but a lot of it can be out of town. We just make sure that it's accessible, because lower income people do tend to drive the economies of service industry.
I want to build on this point of the importance of planning, because you're about to do this yourself. Okay. And in the planning process, you have to do what you have just done in the current lab, which is scenario planning. You have to be thinking of alternatives. So the example that we saw in the community in the transportation situation was one of the alternatives was to create a subway. They couldn't afford it, so they created an above ground subway of buses. And Herman has shown in the chat room his example that happened in La Paz, which is country, Bolivia's neighbor to Brazil, that what their president did was that they put cable cars above the ground. Okay? They couldn't do the bus system, so they hung them in the air on cables. Scenario planning, looking at the alternatives. I want to come back to the PowerPoint that I shared with you. You're in the middle of that normal curve. You're regular. You have to look for alternatives. You have to look for the positive deviants out on the outside of the curve, the ones who are not normal. Okay? And you will find an idea there that you can adapt. So the idea of a park is pretty normal. Okay? The idea of distributing water over the greenway instead of putting it in a pipe, okay? But then how do you get people to use it? And when they use that park, they have a space to go, they're getting inclusive. They're owning the park. They're owning their greenway. So then they're preventing other people from moving in on it. They're owning their future. It's inclusiveness again. By getting the community included, they're your partners. But now let's come back to the three-way partnership of seat scale. That's the planning process. And you're right now in this course about to start the planning process where you need to come up with alternative ideas from the top, outside in your case, that will be adopted by the top down and will be used by the bottom up. That's what planning has to do. It has to make that three-way partnership effective that you're just about to start now. Luke, back to you.
Well, thank you, Daniel. And we do want to turn a bit of time to that, to helping everyone think about the planning. But just to put a cap on our great example of Curitiba, to your point, they created a jobs program. The final thing they did was create a jobs program in waste management, so that the very people who were tasked with keeping these greenways nice are the same people who would be most likely to encroach upon it if their livelihood was not dependent on it. So they've created a job source program. And so to Daniel's point of figuring out how to get these partnerships to work effectively. And this is where Curitiba, it's very easy in the Curitiba, as I said, it's an accessible example of scale squared, just in terms of the basic idea of here's a community that adopted from others, a city even, where from a planning mindset, they adopted good practice, they adapted it to make it cost effective and work for them, and then they implemented it very adeptly. And what we see is that once they did that, many other cities in turn learned from. They became a positive deviance community. They were out on the forefront, and we started to see cities like Cape Town, Prague, New York. I believe towards the end of this class, you get to read the New York chapter where you see and hear about some of the really interesting things happening in New York City that are based on the planning experiences of Curitiba. But in the last 10 minutes here, we want to acknowledge that none of you probably are in a position in this class to go and create a subway system above ground or below, or a cable car system. So what's really important is that before we go, and we don't have too much longer that we're focused on scale squared in this course. And the important thing about scale squared is the best way to learn it is to experience it. And I think you all know what I'm talking about, right? The experience of being someplace that is more powerful than just a description or a picture. You learn it. It's that whole concept of learning by doing. And when you think about scale squared and why it's so important, one option and a good goal to aspire to is one day having your community be a scale squared for other center for others, a place where others can come and learn from best practice. And we've read about a number of those: Pollen, Jamked, now Curitiba, our model counties projects in China. But more important, the reason we're focused on scale squared here is because of the importance for you in realizing that it's okay. And in fact, in order to be successful, you need to go find communities you can copy. Do not try to do this all by yourself. Do not think that the problems you are struggling with have never been, that other people aren't actively struggling with them. Because the important function of scale squared is not to be a scale squared center, but is to know how to use them as a place of learning. Daniel?
Yeah, I want to talk about evidence here, Luke. Before class, you and I were talking about that specifically. And Luke has many times mentioned evidence. One of the things that a scale squared center has is numbers, facts. And so Gunjung works at a scale squared center called Search. and they have the best numbers on child mortality in the world. And that's why everybody around the world is learning from Kunjang's Scale Squared Center. They have good numbers to prove that their neonatal mortality processes really work. And so when you go to a Scale Squared Center, don't look for the stories only. Look for the stories plus the numbers. Because when you see how they're measuring their success, one of the things you can adopt is their measurement system. So you have a way to do your experimentation as you do your adoption of their success. So you're taking the story of the success. You're taking the story of the success, but in a good Scale Squared example, you're also taking their method of monitoring and evaluation so that you can do effective experimentation. And Herman has been bringing useful comments in the chat room, but Luke, I'm back to you because we're wrapping up here.
Sure. And I think, so to that point, what we want you to really think about as you begin to look at your next lab assignment is, what are your Scale Squared centers? Who can you learn from? And remember that the best Scale Squared centers, you're not just copying their results. As Daniel said, you're copying their process. And so this can be where Scale Squared centers, it's easy, it's tempting to go to the ones that have the best stories or the most fun or the closest to you. But in fact, that's not necessarily what you're trying to get from them, right? You know how to have fun. You know how to get in touch with people. What you really want are the people who have evidence, clear evidence that they are able to make this impact, that they're really able to measure it. Because while that really is the difference between, say, a demonstration, a parallel community, and that's important. It's always important for two communities to be in dialogue. But what sets Scale Squared centers, they can prove and they can document their iterative cycle. Right? That's the difference. When we talk about iteration as a criteria, okay, iteration isn't just randomly doing things until one of them works. It is very consciously reviewing what you did last time and figuring out how you could genuinely do it better. And in order for that, you need evidence. And so the best Scale Squared centers are ones where you can see that iterative cycle being documented in evidence, because that makes it very possible to adopt the process and adapt it into your context. Daniel?
Yeah, Grace has asked a very important question in the chat room. And the answer I said, respond to everybody, is yes. Folks, for you to do this next part of the assignment, you should find a Scale Squared center you can learn from. Okay? You should find examples. And so Rosie, why don't you made a good response here. Rosie, why don't you follow on your chat room response?
Absolutely, Grace. So, of course, without even, referring to the seed scale methodology, I think you will all find that there are a lot of communities and programs and organizations that can be fulfilling this role of being a Scale Squared center. And a fabulous sign of that is if they are openly publishing or sharing the lessons that they've learned over the iterative process to help other communities and projects. So a lot of times they might even be called a center of some sort, right? And they have a specific function of doing this type of outreach and convening But you know, you could also find this on a bit of a smaller scale too. But so yeah, sorry, someone tag on here, but basically, you want to find, it might be an organization that's in your region, it might not, but it's an organization that's, you know, doing similar kind of work to you, and might just be a little bit further along in the evolution of their work.
Sure. So Rosie and Grace, it's a great question. It really is. You have intentional scale squared centers. Those are normally run by nonprofit organizations like Future Generations or others. That have very intentionally, as Rosie said, they've set themselves up to be a center or a learning place. But it also is very, very common for a scale squared center to have no idea. Certainly, they're not going to call themselves a scale squared center, but they may have no idea, really, even to the extent to which they're influencing other people. I have certainly been in communities where I went there to learn from their successes, and they kept asking me kind of, why are you here again? Why are you so interested in this again? And I, you know, in some cases I'd say, well, you have been flagged to me that there's something unique happening in this community. What is it? How did it come about? You know, and I remember being, well, I guess it all really started where our town had gotten to be so bad that nobody wanted to be the mayor. And so you couldn't get anybody to be the mayor. And so finally somebody stepped up and said, I'll be the mayor, but no one can just come and argue with me. You know, so you had a selfless mayor where I said, well, that's unique. Let's talk about that. Okay, this is an interesting example. And in some cases, they may know they're distinct or unique for some other reason. So if anybody's been in, has ever been to Lewisburg, West Virginia. Okay, Lewisburg, West Virginia did something very unique about 10 years ago. They had a community mobilization. They got themselves nominated and selected as the coolest small town in America. Well, they didn't really think anything of it 5 or 6 years later. But I started to ask, how did you do that? And what was the result of that? And so sure enough, and we actually took a group of master's students and went and spent a whole day with the mayor of Lewisburg talking about why and how they'd done that. Well, they certainly didn't do it so that one day graduate students would come there and learn about that. They did it as a tourism ploy. But what went into it were a set of processes. So quite often, and this is the point that Daniel and I have been coming back to, it's up to you all to select the case or the scale squared center that is right for you. The hard part about setting up a scale squared center is we normally set it up for something very specific, right? And so like JumpKit is a great scale squared center for comprehensive primary health care. Okay, but then you need to get the word out in that community that there's a good lesson to be learned there. And so this is why it's really important, now that you have your strategy in hand from Lab 2, you need to look at that strategy and say, what would good learning examples of this be?
We're at time.
That's my planning.
But I just, everybody find examples that you can learn from for your community and build those examples into the plan that you're now starting.
So I can hang out and answer questions, but thank you, everybody. I know we're right at time. We will be getting back to this a bit, but find yourself a scale squared center. Learn from it.
See you next week.